story first begins on November the 6th, 1983, spanning to the most recent season taking place during the spring of 1986, well into the Reagan era. Stranger Things has a historical setting and has repeatedly allowed the politics of this era to reflect in its story. So why has there never been a single mention of AIDS? I think that there is a wider story here, that Stranger Things has always been about AIDS. To understand how AIDS is part of Stranger Things' wider narrative, we first have to understand what AIDS is. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. It is the late stage of an HIV infection, HIV standing for Human Immune Virus. HIV is a virus that attacks the immune system, the cells that are used to fight infection, making the infected person vulnerable to further sickness and disease. HIV is spread via certain bodily fluids and is most commonly contracted via unprotected sex and drug use. The body is unable to get rid of HIV and there is no cure for the virus. Therefore, if you contract it, you have it for life. In modern days, there are effective medications that can be used to treat HIV and prevent the development of AIDS and lower the HIV levels, called a viral load, in the blood. Some can be lowered enough to be undetectable. CD4 cells, also commonly referred to as T cells, are a type of white blood cell that is crucial to the immune system. CD4 cell count is the number of blood cells in a cubic millimeter of blood. AIDS is often defined as having a CD4 cell count below 200. In a healthy immune system, CD4 cell count would be around 500 to 1,600. The cell count and/or the contraction of one or more opportunistic infections is often how AIDS is diagnosed. This section is purely historical and factual and will probably be quite long. Before I can get to the main point I'm trying to convey, I feel I need to give the social and political context of when Stranger Things takes place in regards to AIDS. This will be a very simplified and basic timeline focused solely on America, going from 1981 through to 1987, which is the year the last season of Stranger Things will be based in. 4th of April 1981, Sandra Ford, a drug technician, writes a memo about an increased number of requests for the drug pentamidine, typically used to treat severely immunocompromised patients with a rare form of pneumonia. Requests for this drug usually come with an explanation of the patient's underlying condition. The request Ford had been receiving since February had no explanations. All patients are previously healthy young gay men from New York City. Ford's memo is the first alert the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, will receive about what would later be called AIDS. On the 18th of May, 1981, Lawrence Mass became the first journalist to write about the illness with a column titled Disease Rumors Largely Unfounded, published in the gay newspaper The New York Native. The article reports an increase of cases of pneumocystis pneumonia in the city, with 5 or 6 of the 11 reports having been amongst gay men with no clear immunodeficiencies. The CDC Epidemic Intelligence Officer assigned to the New York City Department of Health, Dr. Steve Phillips, tells Mass, quote, "What distinguished these victims is not the case of how or where they were exposed, so much as why they got the disease." On the 5th of June, 1981, the CDC publishes a piece in their Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, also known as the MMWR, about a recent cluster of cases of pneumocystis pneumonia amongst 5 gay men. Quote, "In the period October 1980 to May 1981, 5 young men, all active homosexuals, were treated for biopsy-confirmed pneumocystis pneumonia at 3 different hospitals in Los Angeles, California." End quote. The authors of this article, Los Angeles immunologist Dr. Michael Gottlieb, CDC epidemiologist Dr. Gain Shandera, local intern medicine specialist Dr. Joel Weissman, report that all the men have other unusual infections as well, which indicates that their immune systems are not working. 2 of these men have already died by the time of the article's publication. On the 3rd of July 1981, the New York Times published the article Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals. The term gay cancer enters the public lexicon. This is often cited as the first article written about AIDS. Around the 18th of June 1981, the CDC establishes a task force on Kaposi sarcoma and opportunistic infections, also known as the KSOI task force, to try and establish a reason for the recent outbreaks and help identify and prevent potential risk factors. Dr. James Curran, the head of the CDC's Venereal Disease Control Division, leads the task force. On the 11th of August 1981, Larry Kramer, a gay activist and writer, organizes a meeting of over 80 gay men in his Washington Square apartment to hear from Dr. Alvin Friedman Keene, the doctor who had been quoted in the previously mentioned Times article. This gathering raises $6,635 for Dr. Friedman Keene's AIDS research. This would be the only money raised to fight AIDS this year. 28th of August 1981, the CDC publishes another article in the MMWR reporting that they have received 70 additional cases of Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia since the 3rd of July. There are a total of 108 cases and 107 are men. 94% of those men are gay or bisexual in the case of those whose sexualities are known. 40% of these patients have already died on the time of reporting. Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia were not new diseases at the time of these reports, but both are opportunistic diseases, often only appearing in patients with weakened immune systems. Kaposi sarcoma is a type of skin cancer which creates lesions on the skin. Pneumocystis pneumonia is a fungal infection of the lungs. Both the appearance of these illnesses among previously healthy, often young men was rare and unusual, particularly in their targeting of a specific demographic of homosexual men. These early reports would be the first defining signs of the beginning of the AIDS crisis in America.
Maybe a new mutant type of virus, a cytomegalovirus that has mutated and it is spreading through these individuals, suppressing their immune system and setting them up for these events. But that's just a theory at this period of time.
So far, doctors have only documented 60 known cases among gay men, so it is by no means an epidemic. They are concerned that it is attacking heavily in the gay community, and they're working on theories to explain why. In San Francisco, Linda Yee, News Center 4.
Do we know for certain what causes it?
No.
Do we even know whether it's a virus, bacteria, or what?
There are a lot of theories, but at this point we know nothing for certain.
Do we know how it spreads?
No.
Now, if we don't know how to cure it, it must be spreading like wildfire.
Yes, they're growing at an exponential rate.
September 1981, San Francisco dermatologist Dr. Marcus Conant has a clinic for Kaposi sarcoma at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center. December at the Albert Einstein Medical Center in New York, pediatric oncologist Dr. Aria Rubenstein treats 5 black infants showing severe immunodeficiency, including pneumocystis pneumonia. At least 3 infants are children of women who are drug users or engage in sex work. His claims are dismissed by co-workers who insist that only gay men are affected by this disease. December 10th, 1981, Bobby Campbell, a gay nurse, writes a column titled Gay Cancer Journal for the San Francisco Sentinel, speaking about his experience with Kaposi sarcoma. Campbell would later be known as the AIDS poster boy for being the first person to speak publicly about their own diagnosis and bring awareness to the disease. Early in October, he had posted photos of the KS lesions in the window of a pharmacy at 498 Castro Street in San Francisco to inform the neighborhood of the illness. For many, this was their introduction to AIDS.
I don't know how I got it. I fit the profile of kind of the typical CAPS patient in my age and that I'm gay, but I don't know how I got it.
Among the victims is Bobby Campbell. The San Francisco resident describes himself as the AIDS poster boy.
For me personally, I've had fungal infections, I've had warts, I've had stomatitis, which is an infection of the mouth, so serious that I would not be able to eat, would not be able to talk, and I have cancer.
At the end of 1981, there were 337 reported cases of immunodeficiency in the USA. 321 of them were adults, and 16 were children below the age of 13. 130 were dead by the 31st of December. 4th of January 1982, the Gay Men's Health Crisis is founded in New York. It is the first community-based service provider for gay men with immune deficiencies. In May, Roger McFarlane, a volunteer at the GHMC, sets up the first information and counseling hotline for gay men worried about the Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia outbreaks. He does this using his home phone and receives 100 phone calls on the first night. On the 5th of May, 1982, what would later become known as the San Francisco AIDS Foundation is formed by Dr. Marcus Conant, Frank Jacobson, and Richard Keller. It is known then as the Kaposi Sarcoma Research and Education Foundation. On the 11th of May, 1982, the New York Times publishes the article New Homosexual Disorder Worries Health Officials. This article would be the first to give a name to AIDS, calling it GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. This will reinforce the public perception of this illness only affecting gay men. On the 31st of May, 1982, the first front-page article about AIDS in a major publication appears in the LA Times titled Mysterious Fever, Now an Epidemic. An issue of the MMWR is published on the 18th of June, 1982, and includes an article entitled A Cluster of Kaposi Sarcoma and Pneumocystis Pneumonia Among Homosexual Male Residents of Los Angeles and Orange Counties, California. This is the first article to connect the Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia outbreaks to a possible sexually transmitted agent. The CDC publishes a report in the MMWR on the 16th of July 1982 titled Pneumocystis Pneumonia Among Persons with Hemophilia A. This is the first report of signs of immunosuppression within patients with hemophilia and no underlying risk factors for AIDS. 3 patients listed are dead at the time of publication. On the 24th of September 1982, the CDC releases a new MMWR report where they use the term AIDS for the first time. The MMWR gives the first case report for AIDS. Quote, a disease at least moderately predictive of a defect in cell-mediated immunity occurring in a person with no known cause for diminished resistance to that disease. End quote. 28th of September 1982, Representatives Philip Burton and Ted Weiss introduced the first legislation to allocate funds for AIDS research. The bill requests $5 million for CDC and $10 million for NIH, but dies in committee. The government does not approve funding for AIDS research until July 1983. On the 15th of October 1982, conservative journalist Lester Consolving asked the first question about the AIDS epidemic at a White House press briefing. Press Secretary Larry Speakes admits that he knows nothing about AIDS. He and other members of the White House press corps respond to Consolving's question with laughter and homophobic remarks. December 1982, the CDC's epidemiological notes reports a possible transfusion of AIDS. California announces that a 20-month-old white infant has developed unexplained cellular immunodeficiency and opportunistic infections after requiring multiple blood transfusions shortly after his birth in San Francisco. Donor tracing reveals that one of the baby's donors died of AIDS in August. In breaking the story, the New York Times will prematurely report that the infant has died. On the 17th of December 1982, the CDC reports 22 cases of unexplained immunodeficiency and opportunistic infections in infants. The first AIDS-dedicated clinic, Ward 86, opens at San Francisco General Hospital on the 1st of January 1983. On the 4th of January 1983, the CDC holds a public meeting to decide on how to possibly protect the nation's blood supply from AIDS. They fail to reach a consensus. On the 7th of January 1983, the CDC reports in the MMWR the first cases of AIDS in women who are the sexual partners of men with AIDS. On the 23rd of January 1983, Dr. Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, a virologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, discovers the retrovirus that leads to AIDS. On the 18th of February 1983, Stephen Lawrence Woolwich, the toddler who was the first case of transfusion-related AIDS, dies 16 days before his second birthday. CDC reports in the MMWR on March 4, 1983, that in most cases of AIDS that have been reported, they appear in gay men with multiple sexual partners, intravenous drug users, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. The report also suggests that AIDS may be caused by an infectious agent that is transmitted sexually or through exposure to drugs or blood products. The report issues recommendations for preventing transmission. The AIDS activist Larry Kramer publishes the essay 1121 and Counting in the New York Native. The piece is an aggressive and frantic plea for the gay community to get angry at the lack of government support after the amount of devastation, sickness, and death that has occurred amongst the gay community due to the disease which has been largely ignored.
This disease, many people feel, lies the secret to what causes cancer in general. Why is the NIH dragging its heels so?
You are raising the possibility that people are dismissing it because it strikes mostly the gay community?
There is no question in my mind. If this were happening to you and the white, straight, middle-class community, it would have been attended to a long time ago.
On April 1983, the AIDS Medical Foundation is founded. It is the first private organization dedicated to comprehensive AIDS research. It is founded by Dr. Matilda Kim, Joseph Sonnabend, Michael Callan, Mary Lasker, and Dr. David Baltimore. The foundation is created with the intent of providing money to researchers and scientists with promising AIDS-related projects who have been turned down for government grants. Due to the stigma around AIDS, the foundation cannot list its full name on the lobby signage in the building that its office is located in. In May of 1983, Richard Berkowitz and Michael Callan, both men with AIDS, published a booklet titled How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach. It is a booklet on safer sex that advocates for gay men to use condoms and have fewer sexual partners. It also focuses on self-empowerment for those who are living with AIDS. The printing of the booklet was funded by a $5,000 donation from Randall Close, an AIDS activist and philanthropist. The first AIDS candlelit vigils to honor those who currently have or who have died from AIDS. It is held on May 2, 1983. 10,000 people turn up for the San Francisco March, 5,000 in New York. Marches also take place in LA, Chicago, and Houston. It is the first time that people with AIDS come together for a public demonstration. On the 20th of May, Dr. Françoise Béré-Sinoussi and her colleagues published the first scientific paper to report the discovery of a retrovirus that could be the cause of AIDS. The virus is named HIV. The New York Times publishes its first front-page story on AIDS on the 25th of May, 1983. The article is titled Health Chief Calls AIDS Battle Number One Priority, reporting on the federal response to the AIDS epidemic. June 1983, 11 gay men living with AIDS take over the stage at the National AIDS Forum in Denver and issue a statement on the rights of people living with AIDS. They demand that people with AIDS be at the table when policy is made, to be treated with dignity and to be referred to as people as AIDS rather than AIDS victims. This statement is known as the Denver Principles, and it serves as the beginning for the founding of the National Association of People with AIDS. The U.S. Public Health Service opens the National AIDS Hotline to respond to the public's inquiries about the disease on the 1st of July, 1983. On the first day, the hotline has 13,000 callers, and by the 28th, the hotline has to be expanded from 3 phone lines to 8, due to 8,000 to 10,000 callers phoning daily. On the 1st to the 2nd of August, the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Government Operations holds hearings on the federal response to AIDS. 3 men living with AIDS are invited to speak. Michael Callan from New York, Roger Lyon from San Francisco, and Antonio Ferreira from Washington, D.C.
Congress wants to know what to do about AIDS. Victims of the disease say the government has done nothing and has no plan to. Committee members were told that victims are often gay men or IV drug users, groups already discriminated against. This witness, a victim from San Francisco.
This is not a political issue. This is a health issue. This is not a gay issue. This is a human issue. And I came here today in the hope that my epitaph would not read that I died of red tape.
Bobby Campbell appears on the cover of Newsweek magazine with his partner Bobby Hillard for the story Gay America, Sex Politics and the Impact of AIDS on August the 8th, 1983. This is the first time that 2 gay men are pictured embracing on the cover of a mainstream US national magazine. On the 9th of September 1983, the CDC reports in the MMWR all the major routes of HIV transmission and rules out transmission by casual contact, food, water, air, or environmental surfaces. On the 30th of September 1983, the first AIDS discrimination lawsuit is filed after New York physician Joseph Sonnabend is threatened with eviction from his office for treating patients with AIDS. From the 22nd to the 25th of November 1983, the World Health Organization holds its first meeting to assess the global AIDS situation. From the 1st of January to the 22nd of December in 1983, the CDC received reports of 1,829 new cases of AIDS. Of that number, 537, therefore 29%, have died, bringing the total number of AIDS cases reported to the CDC between January 1st, 1979 and December 22nd, 1983 to 3,064 people, of which 1,292, aka 42%, have died. On the 1st of January 1984, researchers at the University of Miami and the CDC report the first case of AIDS in the wife of a man with hemophilia. This case adds to evidence that AIDS could be transmitted heterosexually by an asymptomatic person. March 1st, 1984. The study from 2 years prior, including evidence that convinced CDC epidemiologists that AIDS is sexually transmitted, is published in the American Journal of Medicine. 13th of July, 1984. The CDC reports that the cause of AIDS is retrovirus. The report also states that the virus discovered by French virologist Françoise Barré-Sinoussi and the virus identified by Dr. Gallo appear to be the same virus. The CDC also reports that the incubation period for the life-threatening manifestations of AIDS may range from 1 year to more than 4 years, end quote. On the 9th of October 1984, the New York Times claims that new scientific evidence suggests that AIDS may be transmissible via saliva. It will be another 2 years before this will be disproven. On the same day, the San Francisco Public Health Director, Dr. Mervyn Silverman, orders 14 bathhouses, sex clubs, bookstores, and porn theaters to close due to being found to encourage sexual contact and that would aid in the spread of AIDS. Many owners defy this order, citing threats to civil liberties, and are able to reopen. On the 11th of January 1985, the CDC revises the AIDS case definition to include the information that AIDS is caused by a virus. The CDC also issues provisional guidelines for blood screening. On the 2nd of March 1985, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, licenses the first commercial blood test, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, to detect HIV. Blood banks also begin screening the blood supply. CDC removes Haitians from the list of individuals with increased risk for AIDS on the 10th of April 1985. From the 15th to the 17th of April 1985, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the World Health Organization host the first International AIDS Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. Approximately 2,000 researchers, physicians, and public health officials from around the world attend. Researchers report 2 drugs in current clinical trials, Suramin in the US and HPA-23 in France. Hudson collapses in Paris, where he has gone to be treated with HPA-23 on the 25th of July, 1985. Following the collapse, he announces he has AIDS. He is the first major U.S. public figure to open up about an AIDS diagnosis. He is also a friend of Ronald Reagan, making his announcement all the more impactful on the U.S.'s reaction to AIDS. His announcement has a major impact on the public perception of AIDS. Following this announcement, AIDS stories in major print media are more than triple in the next 6 months. 28th of July 1985, AIDS Project LA, APLA, holds the first AIDS Walk Los Angeles with the goal of raising $100,000 to provide care for people with AIDS. More than 4,500 walkers attend and $673,000 is raised. 15th, 1985, Los Angeles becomes the first city in the world to pass an anti-discrimination law to protect people living with AIDS. Unanimously approved by the LA City Council, this law bans any discrimination in housing, medical and dental services, business establishments, and public accommodations. Employers, employment agencies, and unions are prevented from refusing to hire people living with AIDS. 27th of August 1985, an Indiana teenager, Ryan White, is refused entry into his middle school. Ryan is a hemophiliac who had contracted AIDS through contaminated blood products. His family's legal battle for Ryan's right to schooling calls national attention to the issue of AIDS. He will be known to many as the public face of the epidemic due to the nature of his story and his willingness to speak publicly about the needs for AIDS education. On the 31st of August 1985, the Pentagon announces that starting from October 1st, they will begin testing new military recruits for HIV, and those who test positive will be denied. On the 17th of September 1985, over 4 years into the pandemic, with 13,000 Americans diagnosed and an estimated 8,000 already dead, a fatality rate of over 60%, President Ronald Reagan first publicly mentions AIDS. Reagan calls AIDS a top priority and defends his administration against criticism that their funding for AIDS research has so far been inadequate.
You know, I'll never forget reading Life magazine when they said, we should all pay attention to AIDS now because now this disease is beginning to strike the rest of us. And I thought, am I not the one holding this magazine in my hand? It took 3 or 4 years before the press picked it up, and only when it became clear that it might enter the heterosexual population.
Gay men continue to be hit hardest, accounting for 3 out of every 4 Americans with AIDS.
Critics point out that the president did not mention the word AIDS in public until he was asked about it in September 1985. Bauer says it was not necessary for the president to talk about AIDS before then.
When it became clear that the disease was going to be a much more major challenge than anyone thought, the president then, I think appropriately, decided to speak out and has done that repeatedly and will do so again in the next 14 months.
2nd of October 1985, Rock Hudson dies of AIDS-related illness, aged 59. Hudson leaves $250,000 in his will to help set up the American Foundation for AIDS Research. Actress and close friend of Hudson's, Elizabeth Taylor, serves as the organization's founding chairman. The same day, the US Congress allocates nearly $190 million for AIDS research, an increase of $70 million over the Reagan administration's budget request. October 1985, the New York State Public Health Council empowers local health officials to close gay bathhouses, bars, and clubs, as well as other places where high-risk sexual activity takes place. On the 27th of November 1985, Cleve Jones organizes that the marchers at the annual Candlelit March to mark the 1978 assassination of Harvey Milk carry signs bearing the names of the loved ones they have lost to AIDS. The march ends at the old San Francisco Federal Building. Jones and his friends tape the signs to the building, creating what looks like a massive patchwork quilt. Jones is inspired by this and will go on to create the AIDS Memorial Quilt, a large collaborative art piece as a tribute to those who have died of AIDS.
Make sure you go over like the center one. Here. Yeah. I love the center. Where's it?
In 1987, in a storefront in San Francisco, friends, families, and lovers began to piece together a quilt. They would soon be joined by tens of thousands of people from across the country, remembering loved ones lost to AIDS.
On December 4th, 1985, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors enacts strict regulations on bathhouses to stop the spread of HIV. The owners of the bathhouses filed to stop the regulations from going into effect. In August of 1986, the court sides with the owners, saying that the venues offer opportunities to provide HIV/AIDS education. CDC publishes an MMWR on the 6th of December 1985 that includes recommendations on preventing mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Some of the recommendations include delaying pregnancy until more is known about the risk of transmission and avoiding breastfeeding. By the time of December 1st, 1985, there have been 217 reported cases of AIDS among children aged 13, and 60% of them have died by the time the MMWR is published. On the 13th of December, 1985, a toddler in Pennsylvania, aged 20 months, Dwight Burke, dies of AIDS-related complications. He is the first child of a hemophiliac known to be born with AIDS. A poll on the December 19, 1985 issue of the Los Angeles Times finds that the majority of Americans favor quarantining people who have AIDS. By the end of 1985, the United Nations states that at least one HIV case has been reported from every major region in the world. On the 16th of January 1986, the CDC reports that more people were diagnosed with AIDS in 1985 than all earlier years combined. There is an 89% increase in new AIDS cases in 1985 compared with 1984. Of all AIDS cases so far, 51% of adults and 59% of children have died. On average, AIDS patients die about 15 months after diagnosis. Public health experts predict twice as many new AIDS cases in 1986. 5th of February 1986, Ronald Reagan announces that he has asked Surgeon General Dr. C. Everett Koop to prepare a major report on AIDS. He states that his administration is determined to find a cure for AIDS. Despite this, the White House proposes a 22% reduction in current funding for AIDS research. On the 21st of February 1986, Ryan White returns to school. In May 1986, the International Committee on the Taxonomy of Viruses announces that the official name for the virus that causes AIDS is human immune deficiency virus, HIV. The CDC reports on the 24th of October 1986 that cases of AIDS disproportionately affect African American and Latino citizens, particularly in cases of children, of which 90% of child and infant cases are made up by Black and Latino children. October 29, 1986, a report by the Institute of Medicine titled Confronting AIDS, Directions for Public Health, Healthcare, and Research is issued, calling for massive media, educational, and public health campaign to curb the spread of HIV infection. The Institute of Medicine also creates the National Commission on AIDS. It is estimated that this will cost a $2 billion investment in research and patient care by the end of the decade. The World Health Organization announces on the 21st of November that the first coordinated global effort to combat AIDS has begun. The World Health Organization describes AIDS as, quote, a health disaster of pandemic proportions, end quote. The State Department announces on the 28th of November, 1986, that all Foreign Service applicants will be tested for HIV starting from the 1st of January 1987, and that those who test positive will be automatically rejected. It is the first time a civilian government agency orders screening for HIV as a condition for employment. 5th of May, 1987, the World Health Organization issues a special report on AIDS, reflecting on the third meeting of participating parties for the prevention and control of AIDS, which took place in Geneva on the 27th and 28th of April, 1987, where they, among other points, discussed the spread of AIDS needing, quote, urgent international action, end quote. They encouraged the World Health Organization to assume a global leadership role for mobilizing and coordinating resources and initiatives for global AIDS prevention, control, and research. On the 12th of March, 1987, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, is founded in New York City. Approximately 300 people arrived to the establishment of the group after 2 days prior. Gay activist Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in Manhattan in which he called for the formation of an AIDS activist group. On the 19th of March 1987, the FDA approves AZT, the first medication to treat AIDS. ACT UP's first ever demonstration took place at the intersection of Broadway and Wall Street on the 24th of March 1987. The choice of the location was with the intention of causing a major disruption during the morning rush hour. Of the approximately 250 protesters, some laid down in the street, while others held signs and called for more government and corporate action to be taken to end the AIDS crisis. ACT UP also specifically targeted the pharmaceutical company that manufactured AZT, Burroughs Wellcome. They protested the high price and inaccessibility of the only FDA-approved drug to combat AIDS. On the 19th of April, Princess Diana is photographed shaking hands with a patient with HIV. This makes international headlines and adds to breaking the myth of AIDS being spread via casual contact. 15th of May, the U.S. Public Health Service adds HIV to the immigration exclusion list, citing it as a dangerous contagious disease. They also mandate testing for all visa applicants. The HIV ban would not lift until the 4th of January 2010. On the 31st of May, Reagan makes his first public speech about AIDS at the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
I want to talk tonight about the disease that has brought us all together. It has been talked about, and I'm going to continue. The poet W.H. Auden said that the true men of action in our times are not the politicians and statesmen, but the scientists. I believe that's especially true when it comes to the AIDS epidemic. Those of us in government can educate our citizens about the dangers. We can encourage safe behavior. We can test to determine how widespread the virus is. We can do any number of things. But only medical science can ever truly defeat AIDS. We've made remarkable progress, as you've heard already. To think we didn't even know we had a disease until June of 1981, when 5 cases appeared in California. The AIDS virus itself was discovered in 1984. The blood test became available in 1985. A treatment drug, AZT, has been brought to market in record time, and others are coming. Work on a vaccine is now underway in many laboratories, as you've been told. In addition to all the private and corporate research underway here at home and around the world, this fiscal year, the federal government plans to spend $317 million on AIDS research and $766 million overall. Next year, we intend to spend 30% more on research, $413 million out of $1 billion overall. Spending on AIDS has been one of the fastest growing parts of the budget. And ladies and gentlemen, it deserves to be.
On the 24th of June 1987, Reagan signs an executive order creating the first presidential commission on AIDS. On the 5th of August 1987, a federal judge orders Florida's DeSoto County School Board to enroll HIV-positive brothers Ricky, Robert, and Randy Ray, who had contracted AIDS from blood transfusions due to hemophilia. On the 28th of August, someone would set fire to the Ray family home, destroying it. On the 18th of August 1987, the FDA sanctions the first human testing of possible vaccines for HIV. On the 21st of August 1987, the CDC issues recommendations for prevention of HIV transmission in healthcare settings and calls for healthcare workers to practice universal precautions. 30th of September 1987, the CDC launches the first AIDS-related PSA for AIDS Awareness Month. The PSA campaign stresses that everyone is at risk of HIV/AIDS. On the 14th of October 1987, the AIDS Memorial Quilt is displayed for the first time. It was displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. during the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. The quilt included 1,920 panels and was able to cover a space larger than a football field.
Bill Krause, Bob Greenwood, Richard Anderson, Reggie Hightower, Gary Barnhill, Simon Guzman, Lawrence, Randy Partlow, Stephen Quesada, Felix Velarde Munoz, John Riddler, Paul Walker, Bill Cathcart, Bobby Campbell, and my friend Marvin Feldman.
Jose Ramirez, George Dutra, Scott Oatman, Gemini Jim, Dick Gamble, Todd Coleman, David Thompson, Larry Long, Frank Cook, and my friend Jeffrey Phillips.
Alfonso McFadder, Rosemary, Marisol, Quinetta Gillespie, and the babies that I have loved and cared for, Tony, Langston, and Connie.
Alan, Bert, Dominic, Martha, Costa Catrales, William Paul Chase, David Wade, Dean McDowell, Bill Benville, Paul Richards.
The amount of news stories about AIDS peaked around 86 to 87, with new cases on a steep rise peaking in the early 90s. Effective HIV treatment would not be in place for another decade. Even then, the AIDS epidemic is far from over worldwide, with Southern Africa still reporting high levels of cases of HIV within the last few years, and discrimination against those with a positive HIV statement, even in countries with access to effective treatment, is still prevalent. My sources for this section and others are listed below in my bibliography if you want to learn more. My timeline has been a very simplified summary focusing on one area and demographic. For a proper understanding of AIDS and its effects on people and culture, you'd have to look much further than just one video, and I hope you do.
Something is coming. I'm hungry for blood.
This is the show's opening line and serves as an introduction to the themes of the story, as well as foreshadowing for the main threat in Season 1.
A shadow grows on the wall behind you, swallowing you in darkness. It is almost here. What is it?
What if it's the Demogorgon? Oh, Jesus, we're so screwed if it's the Demogorgon.
It's not the Demogorgon.
Demogorgon is an apt metaphor for AIDS. It is a creature from a biohazardous reflection of our world, one that is diseased and hazardous to the body, entering through yonic portals and using blood to kill and consume its victims.
The Demogorgon!
Brenner confirms that there are 6 victims taken by the Demogorgon by the end of the season.
6 people have been taken this week.
First victim is the scientist in the opening scene. There's not much insight to be taken from him, though his attack occurs directly before the opening line, so despite a lack of clear imagery, his death is linked to blood. Will Byers is the most important victim of the Demogorgon, with this season focusing around his disappearance and its effect on the town, his friends, and family. Will's attack is ominously foreshadowed by his conversation with Mike.
It was a 7. Huh? Whoa, it was a 7. The Demogorgon. It got me.
It foreshadows this season's plot, but it also serves as the audience's first and only real insight into Will as a character, outside of a couple flashback scenes in later episodes, as he is missing for the majority of the show. We learn 2 important things about him here. First, he is honest, he refuses to lie to Mike. And second, he and Mike have a unique bond that the other boys don't. Will Byers' gay coding is not subtle.
He's a sensitive kid. Lonnie used to say he was queer, called him a
Is he?
He's missing, is what he is. I hate to break it to you, Toothless, but he's not in danger. He's dead. That's what my dad says. So he was probably killed by some other queer.
Trying to force you to like normal things. And you shouldn't like things because people tell you you're supposed to. Okay?
Besides, what's there to be sad about anyway? Will's in fairyland now, right? Flying around with all the other little fairies, all happy and gay. La 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 la.
More than just coding, this character trait is not a suggestion. In July 2022, in an article with Variety, Noah Schnapp, who plays Will, spoke on Will's sexuality. Quote, "Obviously, it was hinted at in season 1. It's always kind of there, but you never really knew. Now that he's gotten older, they made it a very real, obvious thing. Now it's 100% clear that he is gay and he does love Mike. But before, it was a slow arc. Knowing this coding was intentional since the beginning, it adds more weight to the Demogorgon as a representation of AIDS. The first 2 mentions of the creature are in direct relation to blood and the beginnings of a gay coming of age. Barb's death is one coded in blood, queerness, and sex. After she cuts her hand with a blade shared amongst the group, her blood attracts the Demogorgon. The character coded as queer. Her close friendship with Nancy and refusal to participate in the expected heterosocial antics of her friends, as well as her discomfort with Nancy sleeping with Steve, being what drives a wedge between the 2 girls.
So stupid. I'm just gonna drop you off.
Barb, come on. You promised that you'd go. You're coming. We're gonna have a great time.
He just wants to get in your pants.
No, he doesn't.
Man, seriously. He invited you to his house. His parents aren't home. Come on, you are not this stupid.
Tommy H. and Carol are gonna be there.
Tommy and Carol have been having sex since like 7th grade. It'll probably just be like a big orgy.
Gross.
I'm serious.
All right, well, you can be like my guardian, all right? Make sure I don't get drunk and do anything stupid.
Is that a new bra?
No.
Nancy, where are you going?
Nowhere. Just upstairs to change. I fell in the pool. Why don't you go ahead and go home? I'll get a ride or something.
Man,
Barb, I'm fine.
this isn't you.
I'm fine. Just go ahead and go home, okay?
Barb is the only person at the pool party not to engage in heterosexual sex. Tommy H. and Carol sleep together the same night as Steve and Nancy. As Barb dies, Steve and Nancy's sex scene flashes. In my opinion, this scene shows the naivety and ignorance of the heterosexual population and their lack of adjustment to their sex lives during the time of age. The next Demogorgon victim, Shepard, is somewhat of an outlier, seeing as he was sent to the Upside Down, but we do get a connection to blood with his death.
Everything's still here, but it's all eroded. Covered in oil.
Dale and Henry are mentioned by Powell and Callahan.
Hey, so Bev Mooney came in this morning all upset. Said that Dale and Henry went hunting yesterday,
and they didn't come back home.
She thought they were on another binger, but she's not so sure now.
This is said in the same episode as when Nancy and Jonathan find the dead deer, which attracts the Demogorgon via its blood. From this we can assume that the deer was shot by Dale and Henry, who were then attacked by the Demogorgon, which was attracted to the blood of the deer. The reactions in the town to Bob and Will's disappearances are reflective of the American public's reaction towards AIDS as well. As shown in the timeline, in 1983, AIDS stories and discussions were only just becoming somewhat relevant to everyday Americans, so it would not be considered a mainstream topic until around 1985 to 1987. The reaction to Will's disappearance is that of homophobic jokes and mockery. If we look back at the White House recording from just a year prior, we see the same attitude of homosexuality as the punchline to AIDS. The Demogorgon and the Upside Down's parallels to AIDS encompass this entire season from start to finish. In the final episode, Dr. Brenner's conversation with Joyce stands out as significant for this reason.
This thing that took your son, we don't really understand it, but its behavior is predictable. It will take more sons, more daughters.
This scene is followed by Hopper threatening to leak information to the Times.
I did give all this over to my friend at the Times. He's going to blow this thing wide open.
It's possible that the friend he is referring to is Murray Bauman, who joins the show in season 2 and previously worked for the Chicago Sun-Times. But seeing as Hopper used to be a policeman in New York City prior to season 1, it's more likely that he means the New York Times, which in 1981 published the first major newspaper article about AIDS. Will is consistently coded and surrounded by illness. Sarah Hopper is the deceased daughter of Chief Jim Hopper, who leads the search for Will. Almost every single mention of Sarah in the first season is in relation to Will.
He's a good student. What? Will? He's a good student. Great one, actually. I don't think we've met. Scott Clark. Get your Hawkins Middle. Earth and biology.
Always had a distaste for science. Sarah, my daughter. Galaxies, the universe, whatnot. She always understood all that stuff.
It was not a prank, it was him.
Joyce.
Come on, how about a little trust here? You think I'm making this up?
I'm not saying that you're making it up. All I'm saying is it's an emotional time for you.
And you think I don't know my own son's breathing? Wouldn't you know your own daughter's?
Listen to me. After Sarah, I saw her too. And I heard her. I didn't know what was real. And then I figured out that it was in my mind. And I had to pack all that away. Otherwise I was going to fall down a hole that I couldn't get out of.
Oh, you're talking about grief. This is different.
I'm just saying.
I know what you're saying, Hop. I swear to you, I know what I saw.
Your daughter, she got a name? What? Your daughter. What's her name?
Sarah? Her name's Sarah? Sarah. I recognize you. You famous or something? You might have seen me on TV. I found that Byers boy. Hey. What? We're gonna find him.
Yeah, like Terry found her daughter.
We're close.
12 years. 12 years she's been looking for her.
When she shows up at Benny's 5 nights ago, which means we got a chance. You know what I would give for a chance? You know what I would give?
Sarah died of cancer, a type that we can assume is linked to a respiratory issue based on her struggling to breathe and her breathing tube. Sarah's respiratory issues due to her cancer are directly parallel to Will's breathing issues in the Upside Down. The sickness he exhibits appears to have a few parallels to pneumocystis pneumonia, a fungal infection of the lungs that develops from the growing of specimens inside of the lungs. This is similar to what we can assume would have happened to Will after breathing in the particles from the Upside Down. We can't talk about Will's coding in relation to HIV/AIDS without discussing some of the more disturbing aspects of the season. When found in the Upside Down, Will Byers is almost dead, blue, corpse-like, and stiff. He has a tube down his throat. It's no secret that Stranger Things borrows from the movie Alien. The facehuggers of the Alien franchise are an obvious parallel and source of inspiration for this scene. They are also an apt metaphor for oral rape.
He said, what? You have the answer? I said, I have the answer. The alien fucks him. He said, what? What are you talking about? I said, jumps on his face. It's a little creature then, little baby squid-like, sticks a tube down his throat, starts feeding him air, but he's implanting his seed, and it's going to grow inside him and burst out of his chest in the middle of the movie.
Having conversations with Ron Suchet about wasps that procreate by planting their eggs into other insects. It was kind of all these things were sort of coming together and were being sewn into the script.
Ron, in a way, was really fascinated with the idea of human beings being a host for an embryo. That human beings were the nutrition for an embryo.
I think, particularly the incubus is one that struck me when I read the script. Because that chest burster comes out and sits there for a moment and screams, and that's just as you imagine an incubus would do. It would come out, sit, and scream at you.
I love that image so much, and what I see in it is something that's like a material object trying to come to life. And that's what Alien is.
And there's no way of looking at Alien without seeing it as a male fantasy of the kind of oppression that had been being handed out to women over the centuries, a guilt that was part of masculinity in the 1970s and should be part of masculinity now. Alien has within it fantasies of male pregnancy, fantasies of male rape, fantasies of male penetration, and it's all tied up with that amazing chest burster scene.
I don't know how explicitly they realized what they were doing. I can't imagine that any studio would be like, yes, you're making a male rape movie in space, for sure, let's go for it. It's wonderful that the unconscious works in so many mysterious ways.
The tube that is in Will's throat when he's found is part of the Upside Down's hive mind and is made of biological reproductive material. He has been forcibly penetrated by the organ of a living thing in order for it to reproduce using his body as an incubator. The slug that Will cuffs up being the young of this upside down vine. This is not just metaphorical, but by all means is a literal experience of rape. This scene in episode 3, where Carol and Tommy mock Bob and make fun of Nancy for having sex with Steve, starts with Carol saying that she has a mark on her ankle.
Thanks, man. It's a heated pool.
Well, if it's not frostbite, what is it?
I don't care what it is. It's disgusting. Just get it off the table. We're eating here.
This mark is entirely insignificant to the story and is never brought up again, but it did remind me of something. If you remember from the timeline, one of the first instances of public information about AIDS was when Bobby Campbell spoke about his Kaposi sarcoma. which he first recognized by seeing a mark on the bottom of his foot. I'm not implying that Carol has AIDS or developed Kaposi sarcoma overnight. That's not possible. Just that this is an interesting scene to put in, and it has no correlation with the rest of the plot and reminded me of Bobby Campbell. Government cover-ups and scientific research being interfered with for political reasons are major themes this season, which although have much more to do with MKUltra than AIDS, it does draw parallel to the ignorance and suppression of stories and voices surrounding AIDS, with Reagan yet to mention AIDS publicly for another 2 years from this time. Episode 5 is titled The Flea and the Acrobat. In this episode, a metaphor is used to explain how the Demogorgon travels between the real world and the Upside Down. A flea is used in place of the Demogorgon for this metaphor.
Picture an acrobat standing on a tightrope. Now the tightrope is our dimension, and our dimension has rules. You can move forwards or backwards. But what if right next to our acrobat there is a flea? Now the flea can also travel back and forth, just like the acrobat, right?
Right.
Here's where things get really interesting. The flea can also travel this way, along the side of the rope. He can even go underneath the rope.
Upside down.
Exactly.
But we're not the flea, we're the acrobat.
In this metaphor, yes, we're the acrobat.
Fleas are often associated with the spreading of illness and disease due to being the main cause of the spread of the bubonic plague as well as rats. I've skipped over discussions of 11 so far as my main points about her correlate directly to her arc in season 4, so I'll come back to discussing her later. Metaphors of illness increase in the second season, with Will experiencing PTSD flashback episodes that are being monitored by Hawkins' lab. Will being taken out of school to a private research facility where his blood is drawn and his health is monitored is not exactly subtle. His possession quite heavily parallels that of child sexual abuse and rape. TV Tropes lists mind rape as one of Will Byers' tropes in reference to his possession in this season. Mind rape is a trope described by TV Tropes as an assault on a character's mind where, quote, minimal to no sexual contact actually occurs, but as the name indicates, everything else is there to resemble a rape, the ultimate violation of privacy and consent. This is true of Will's possession, with rape and abuse subtext being abundantly clear in how he describes and feels about this experience.
I can't remember. I need you to try. I was on the field and then it all just went blank and then you were there. Well, I need you to tell me the truth. I am. This shape, I saw it on the videotape from Halloween night. It's the same shape as your drawing. These episodes that you're having, I think Dr. Owens is wrong. I think they're real. But I can't help you if I don't know what's going on. So you have to talk to me. Please. No more secrets, okay? Okay. Did you see this thing again on the field? Yes. What is it? No. It's almost like a feeling. Like the one you had that night at the arcade. Yes. What does it want? I don't know. It came for me. And I tried. I did try to make it go away. But it got me, Mom. Well, what does that mean? I felt it everywhere. Everywhere. I still feel it. I just want this to be over. It's okay. It's okay. Listen, look at me. I will never, ever let anything bad happen to you ever again. Whatever's going on in you, we're gonna fix it. I will fix it. I promise. I
I'm here.
Will parallels the reaction and process of many rape victims. At first, he is ashamed and hesitant to explain what has happened. Joyce has to push him to open up by asking him to talk. It got me is vague language. He's sparing the details out of shame and fear. Then the obvious I felt it everywhere, repeated for emphasis, everywhere, all throughout his body and mind. His I still feel it, mirroring that of many of those who develop PTSD from a sexual assault. It becomes a lifelong experience rather than one moment. I just wanted this to be over, solidifying that the moment of the assault feels as if it is still happening. The experience is not over for him. Much like the aftermath of Will's experience in the Upside Down in the previous season, following this attack and possession, Will becomes ill. Although sometimes asymptomatic, after contracting HIV, some will experience flu-like symptoms. A few of these include night sweats, weight loss,
See, you shaved off a pound since we saw you last.
coughing, fatigue,
A little out of it. Like, I haven't really woken up yet.
chills, and or fever.
Is it a fever? No. Actually, cold.
The rest of Hawkins' perception of Will's disappearance is not made entirely clear to the audience, but we can piece together a general idea from a few key scenes. From the beginning of his disappearance, Will's homosexuality has been assumed to be linked to all the cause of his vanishing, with the implications of Troy's comment about his father believing another homosexual had killed or abducted and killed Will, giving us one of the very few insights into the rest of the town's beliefs surrounding Will's disappearance.
David's probably killed by some other queer.
A newspaper article that Will finds in his locker in Season 2 says, quote, "In a recent statement, the state coroner's office has admitted to misidentifying the body recovered from the Sackler quarry as 12-year-old Will Byers. Will Byers had gone missing 2 days prior, inspiring the town of Hawkins to form a search party in the hopes of finding him. When a boy's body was recovered from the Sackler quarry, the case seemed solved. 6 days later, local police, led by Chief Jim Hopper, found Byers alive in an abandoned cabin a few miles outside of Hawkins. The police launched an investigation into the state coroner and have since arrested him. Chief Hopper declined to comment on the coroner's arrest." End quote. The cabin is an odd detail. Lucas's explanation to Max only mentions the woods, which she hesitates to believe.
I still don't get why they call him Zombie Boy. I mean, I get it, you're lost in the woods for a week or something, but why is he a zombie? Because everyone thought he was dead?
Yeah, I mean, we had a funeral for him and everything. After a week. Well, see, some other kid drowned at the quarry. He thought it was Will because his body was super decomposed.
What? Okay, that's not funny.
It's not a joke, right? It's public knowledge. You can ask anybody except Will because he is really sensitive about it. Alright?
So from the town's perspective, Will goes missing, and some adults believe that he was abducted by a homosexual. He's found in an abandoned cabin just outside of town and is taken to hospital. He comes back sick and visibly traumatized. He's jumpy and quiet, and sometimes he gets escorted out of class to go to doctor's appointments, though no illness is named. If it's not obvious, most of the town believes that Will was abducted and raped, leading him to contract HIV/AIDS, and in a way he was. Though a victim of the Demogorgon, that may not be what took him that night. It is very likely that Will was abducted by a man, or what once was a man, Vecna, to the scene of the lock on the door of Will's house being opened telekinetically, something that no other Demogorgon has ever done, but we know that Vecna is capable of. In Season 4, we also learn that Vecna's presence in the Upside Down interferes with electricity in the real world.
It's like the Christmas lights. Christmas lights. When Will was in the Upside Down, the lights came to life.
Vecna's here. In this house. Just on the other side.
If we go back and watch the beginning of Season 1 with this in mind, Will's disappearance appears much more like a calculated abduction. The TV in Mike's house malfunctions while Will is inside.
Jump.
Oh, I got it! Is this 7-year-old?
The light on the porch flickers as Will stands beneath it.
See you tomorrow.
The light on his bicycle does too. In child abductions, the perpetrator watches and waits until Will is alone before attempting abduction and taking him to a secondary location. Then there is the state he is found in at the end of Season 1 that I previously discussed. By all explanations, this is abduction and rape. The name Zombie Boy is given to Will after his disappearance. We see it written on the newspaper clipping where the article previously mentioned appears. It is also said to him by bullies on Halloween.
Watch it move, Zombie Boy.
The implications of this nickname become clear knowing the town's perception of his vanishing. Obviously, a zombie is an undead creature, and Will was presumed dead. But in addition to this, zombies are also disease carriers. Whether it is a zombie virus or a supernatural spell, zombies have always been sickly and have spread their condition through invasive human contact. The nickname is about Will having AIDS. If you remember from the timeline, Ryan White was a young boy with hemophilia who contracted AIDS via blood transfusion. Ryan White made headlines in 1985 when he was denied entry into his middle school due to his diagnosis. This led to Ryan receiving a large amount of publicity due to the lawsuit filed by his family to try and get Ryan to be allowed to attend school, which they later won. Ryan White is one of the most well-remembered public figures with AIDS. His funeral in 1990 was attended by influential figures such as Elton John, Michael Jackson, and then First Lady Barbara Bush. To many, Ryan is the face of the AIDS epidemic. White, like Will Byers, was also born in 1971 in Indiana. The town of Kokomo, where Ryan was born, is a very close match for what the real-life version of the fictional setting of Hawkins would be. Ryan's parents divorced when he was 7 years old, and he was raised primarily by his mother. There's no definitive year given in the show for when Will's parents divorced, but based on cast comments and other events in the show, Will was around the same age as Ryan was, somewhere between 5 and 9. December of 1984, that Ryan White was diagnosed with AIDS. Will is admitted to hospital sometime in November of the same year, where his condition is described as a virus. It's earlier the same year that AIDS is confirmed to come from a virus and HIV is named.
Our best guess right now is it's some kind of virus duplicate. It spreads, essentially hijacking the host. The virus is alive. It has an intelligence. The good news is the virus can be cured. We're going to continue to run tests, and we're going to see what we find.
Ryan White's autobiography and the film depicting his life show him having a lot of similar traits to Will as well.
Ryan White was a so-called innocent victim of AIDS. That was a polite way of saying that he wasn't gay or an intravenous drug user. He got the disease from a bad blood transfusion. By the end of his life, he also got a lot of compassion, but it was awfully late coming.
You and I were chatting, before we went on the air, and you were telling me some of the charges that the kids were leveling against you while you were in school back in Kokomo. Just tell our audience about that, would you?
Well, they marked my folders. They marked fag and other cruel things.
He has a couple of friends, but, they're mean. They make fun of him. They call him names. He's a sensitive kid. Lonnie used to say he was queer, called him a fag.
Is Ryan going to be introduced to TV?
I don't know. I'd rather say your brother's a faggot. He is not
He's dead. That's what my dad says. So he was probably killed by some other queer.
Especially on this day, we know how you really got it.
What do you mean?
People think I'm gay.
Really?
Gays aren't the only people who get it.
Besides, what's there to be sad about anyway? Will's in fairyland now, right? Flying around with all the other little fairies, all happy and gay.
No. Shut it!
Watch it, zombie boy.
Mom's here, come on, let's go. I've been real tired all day.
It's burning up. Honey, you're burning up.
I don't feel so good.
Lie down. Okay, go on. Just lay right down. Watch your eyes. Still 104. I'm taking you to the hospital.
I don't feel that bad. I just can't breathe.
Honey, you got 104 fever. Dr. Field said if you got up to 104, take you to the hospital.
No.
Ryan, we gotta go.
Last night, so weird. Yeah.
Is it a fever?
No. Actually, cold. Do you feel cold?
No. Just a little out of it. Like I haven't really woken up yet. We promised your doctor.
Called your father. Told him they're operating all right.
He's not coming, right?
Right. I'll call him later with the results.
Why? He doesn't care.
Why didn't you call Mom back? I just assumed she just forgot where he was. You know, he was lost or something. Boy never was very good at taking care of himself.
Ryan has a type of infection that normal children just don't get. It's called pneumocystis. Since we know he has it, and since we also know that he's been getting blood products for a long time to treat his hemophilia, our major consideration is that a virus has severely damaged his immune system. Mrs. White, Ryan has AIDS.
Our best guess right now is it's some kind of virus, which is causing this neurological disorder. Now, when a typical virus attaches itself to its host, it duplicates, it spreads, essentially hijacking the host. A virus is alive. It has an intelligence. That's not unusual. What is so unusual here? This virus, the infected hosts seem to be communicating. It has some sort of a hive intelligence, and it's connecting all the hosts. The good news is the virus can be cured. We're going to continue to run tests, and we're going to see what we find.
What about Christmas?
Don't worry. gonna get your Christmas presents, whether it be here or at home. Mom, Dad, look, he's doing so much better. Hope to get him off the respirator in a few days.
That's great.
By Christmas? I hope so.
We'll always love Christmas, you know. So I thought if I put the lights up, he'd feel like he was home somehow. It's silly, I know. No.
Some people like Kenny Rogers.
Kenny Rogers? I love Kenny Rogers.
No. What? He likes it cold.
Temperature is a major plot point this season, with the shadow monster possessing Will and its hive mind thriving in the cold and suffering when confronted with high temperatures. Symptoms of HIV's flu-like symptoms relate directly to temperature, with fever and chills being common signs of infection. But outside of the body is where temperatures have a stronger effect on the virus. To cause survival of HIV-1 in syringes, effective temperature during storage, Yale University researchers found that, quote, at 4 degrees Celsius, 50% of all syringes contained viable HIV-1 at 42 days of storage, the longest storage duration tested. At room temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, the last day that syringes with 2 microliters of infected blood were positive was day 21, and viable HIV was recovered from 8% of syringes, end quote. Meaning that when kept in lower temperature, HIV survived the longest, and when kept in warmer temperatures, it eventually killed it. While the temperature's effect only applied to the virus when outside of the body, I feel the information is still relevant to adding to this metaphor. Heat and fire is used repeatedly throughout the series to kill and drive out the shadow monster from the host, while the cold seems to almost incubate or encourage it.
We're very much the same. When we encounter danger, our hearts start pounding. These are the signs of the physical and emotional state we call fear. Hey, you reached Cam. I'm probably doing something incredible right now.
Oh. Yes. What is it? It's too hot. I can cool it down a little bit, baby, but we gotta get your body temp back up. No. What? He likes it cold.
There's another thing. Reptiles, they're cold-blooded. Ectothermic, right? They love heat. The sun, Dart hates it. It hurts him.
No. Actually, cold. Do you feel cold? What's happening? It hurts. Ah! Oh, it hurts! Oh, it hurts! It hurts!
It's contained. What if there's a leak? A leak.
Operation Denver, or Operation Infection, was a disinformation campaign ran by the KGB during the 1980s that had the intention of planting the idea that HIV/AIDS was a bioweapon created as part of a program at the Pentagon. The story is that the virus spread from Fort Detrick, the center of the U.S.'s biological weapons program. The story first appeared in the Indian pro-Soviet newspaper Patriot. Published in July 1983, the article reads, quote, AIDS, the deadly mysterious disease which has caused havoc in the U.S., is believed to be the result of the Pentagon's experiments to develop new and dangerous biological weapons. Now that these menacing experiments seem to have gone out of control, plans are being hatched to hastily transfer them from the U.S. to other countries, primarily developing nations where governments are pliable to Washington's pressure and persuasion. All claims that this information comes from a well-known American scientist and anthropologist who wants to remain anonymous. Of course, this well-known American scientist did not exist, and almost no scientist supported this claim. However, biophysicist Jacob Siegel, a retired former professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin, added to the claims. Siegel wrote a report entitled AIDS, Its Nature and Origin, which he then distributed as booklets across multiple countries in Africa. These booklets described his hypothesis that AIDS was created in the United States deliberately to infect homosexuals and prisoners. His reports held no real evidence. This season delves further into government conspiracy and cover-ups in regards to the lab, with Nancy attempting to get justice for Barb and her family after her death.
Mistakes.
Yes.
You killed Barbara.
Abundant mistakes, but the men involved with those mistakes, the ones responsible for what happened to your brother and Miss Holland's death, they're gone. They're gone, and better for worse, I'm the schmuck they brought in to make things better. But I can't make things better without your help.
You mean without us shutting up?
She's tough, this one. You guys been together long?
We're not together.
Want to see what really killed your friend? Teddy. Brought you an audience today. Hope you don't mind.
More the merrier, sir.
I'd call it one hell of a mistake. Wouldn't you? See, the thing is, we can't seem to erase our mistake. But we can stop it from spreading. Like pulling weeds. But imagine for a moment if a foreign state, let's say the Soviets, if they heard about our mistake. Do you think they would even consider that a mistake? What if they tried to replicate that? The more attention we bring to ourselves, the more people like the Hollands know the truth, the more likely that scenario becomes. You see why I have to stop the truth from spreading too. Same as those weeds there. By whatever means necessary.
After recording an incriminating tape, Nancy brings this information to a conspiracy theorist and disgraced reporter. They decide to leak the information or water it down to state that Barb was killed by a leak from the Hawkins lab.
We water it down.
Precisely. Wait, what? Your story. We moderate it. Just like this drink here. We make it more tolerable. Perhaps Barbara was exposed to some dangerous toxins.
A leak from the lab. Like 3 Mile Island or something.
Something scary but familiar. Close enough that it hits the man right where it hurts.
And those assholes that killed Barb.
They'll go down.
Since the release of the incendiary tape, the once quiet town of Hawkins, Indiana has spent time in a place it never expected, the national spotlight. Under mounting pressure, several high-ranking members from the U.S. Department of Energy have admitted involvement in the death and cover-up of Hawkins resident Barbara Holland, who died due to exposure to an experimental chemical asphyxiant, which had leaked from the grounds of the lab.
Also the demodogs that quite literally do congregate in and escape from the lab. A type of biological weapon of their own, they spread from the lab across the town without being detected. HIV has a 7-stage life cycle: binding, fusion, reverse transcription, integration, replication, assembly, and budding. The biology and life cycle of HIV is complex, but in a very simplified summary, HIV attaches itself to cells in the body and then enters the DNA. It then replicates and creates more infected cells, and then spreads a stronger version of the infected cells throughout the body. Because of HIV's ability to replicate and grow stronger, treating it is difficult and requires multiple medications that attack the different stages of the life cycle. The flayed starts with rats. Like fleas, they are associated strongly with the spread of disease, having been one of the main carriers of the plague. Particles that left Will's body at the end of Season 2 enter into the body of the rat. The rat then changes and mutates, exploding into biological matter that then comes together to create a stronger, flesh-based creature referred to as the Mind Flayer. Like HIV, the rats grow and change into something stronger. From here, the Mind Flayer begins infecting people. When flayed, the people show similar symptoms to Will's possession in Season 2. Resistant to heat, connected to the hive mind, and controlled as part of the hive mind. When commenting on the flayed, Will explains being dormant.
I don't know. It looks pretty normal to me.
Normal? How many times have you seen him with the shirt on?
I mean, it's a little weird.
More than a little. He was in a tub with ice. The mind flayer likes it cold. Plus everything else saw.
But he's lounging at the pool, which is like the least mind flayer thing ever.
Not necessarily. The mind flayer likes to hide. He only used me when he needed me. It's like you're dormant. And then, when he needs you, you're activated.
Similarly, HIV can lay dormant for multiple years before becoming obvious. Billy is attacked and flayed by the mind flayer, making him a carrier for this condition. From him, it spreads to his co-worker Heather, to her family, and eventually across town. The allegory for a transmissible disease is overt in the spread of the flayed. Other flayed transmit their condition to others is significant too. When Billy flays Heather, the scene plays out in a way that heavily mirrors the build-up to a rape scene. The phrase, "stay still, it will all be over soon," is particularly chilling and is repeated multiple times in this context throughout the season.
Really sorry about this, Daddy, but it'll all be over soon. I promise.
Try not to move. Don't be afraid. It'll be over soon. Just try and stay very still.
The actual flaying that we see plays out in a way that is incredibly similar to Alien's facehuggers, which, as previously discussed, are strongly associated with rape. Furthermore, the previous parallel to facehuggers in the series was inherently sexual, in that it was an attempt to reproduce. So essentially, flaying is sexually transmissible. Billy Hargrove, by name alone, is a foil to Will Byers. Both named William and both with abusive absent fathers, the two become possessed by a force from the Upside Down in seasons 2 and 3 respectively. While Billy exists as a dark reflection of Will in terms of morality, he also does so in story. As previously discussed, Will's homosexuality is tied directly to his dealings with the Upside Down and hold immense weight in the subtextual narrative about AIDS, specifically in the negative perception tied to his sexuality. I'd argue Billy's narrative tells a similar story with bisexuality. Like homosexuals, bisexual men had their own exposure and prejudicial connotations to deal with during the AIDS crisis, along with the usual homophobia. The New York Times published the article AIDS Spectre for Women, The Bisexual Man, on the 3rd of April 1987. The article discussed heterosexual women's fears of contracting AIDS from bisexual men, the idea being that bisexual men bridge the gap between homosexual and heterosexual relations, passing what is seen as a homosexual disease to heterosexuals. Quote Dr. Teresa Crenshaw, then president of the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. She says, quote, homosexuals have been out of the closet a long time, but bisexuals have not. Straight women are going to discover some very unpleasant news about some of the men that they have known. However, this fear was mostly unfounded. The article also stating that, quote, the greatest threat comes from intravenous drug users. Only about 4% of diagnosed AIDS cases thought to have been transmitted through heterosexual intercourse, and fewer than 1 in 10 of those appear to involve bisexual men, according to a New York study. However, the article goes on to quote Dr. Lord Humphreys, a Los Angeles psychotherapist who had written a paper that was an examination of homosexual and bisexual men. He describes a category of bisexual men as ambisexuals, which were, as stated in the article, quote, a small but dangerous group of men who have very frequent sexual contact with both men and women, end quote. Humphreys states that, quote, basically, they don't care if a partner is a man or a woman as long as that person is good-looking and sexually active. I consider this group the most dangerous in the cross-infection of AIDS because these men are likely to be drug abusers as well, overlapping their high-risk behavior. End quote. Bisexual bridge theory still continues to affect the lives of bisexual men today, with recent studies showing that bisexual men are less likely to be aware of their HIV status, less likely to be tested. A 2016 survey showed that 63% of women say they would not sleep with a man who had sex with other men. And a 2020 study showed that bisexual people in general are 3 times less likely to be out to their family than gay men and lesbians. Second season of Stranger Things, there is a scene where Billy is confronted by his father and called a faggot. Then, seemingly contradicting this statement, his father tells Billy to cancel his date with, quote, whatever whore he's seeing, end quote. The use of faggot, followed by the comment about Billy's date, shows a coding of dual attraction. The only other character to be called this slur in the show is Will, who, like Billy, was insulted by his father. However, one use of a slur is not definitive queer coding. The scenes of flirtatious intimidation between Billy and Steve in the second season stand out particularly in that they are almost completely one-sided on Billy's part.
Harrington, right? I heard you used to run this school. That's true. Can't see that he's quiet, huh? Said he turned bitch. Hey, maybe you should just shut up and play the game. Am I dreaming, or is that you, Harrington? Yeah, it's me. Don't cream your pants. What are you doing here, amigo? Yeah, I could ask you the same thing, amigo.
Most significant, however, is the communal shower scene. It doesn't take much analysis to see the homoerotic undertones of the interaction, particularly in how Billy's mannerisms and actions differ from the two heterosexual men in the scene with him. Gay undertones of the scene, paired with Billy's comment confirming his relationships with women, adds more weight to his coding as bisexual.
Don't sweat it, Harrington. Today's not your day, man. Yeah, you know you're weak. You and the princess break up for one day. She's already running off with the freak brother. Oh, shit. You don't know. Jonathan and the princess skipped yesterday, still haven't shown. But that must just be a coincidence, right? Don't take it too hard, man. A pretty boy like you's got nothing to worry about. Plenty of bitches in the sea. Am I right? I'll be sure to leave you some.
Along with this scene, Billy is consistently in and around public showers throughout both seasons. Before the AIDS crisis fully struck the United States, gay bathhouse culture was one of the main ways to socialize, have sex, and be around other queer people, mainly homosexual and bisexual men. As it began to spread, the bathhouses became a large debate within the community and the city, as they were a hotspot for unprotected sex and the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Eventually, in the mid-1980s, most bathhouses were closed. Another significant moment is when in Season 2, Billy is infected with the same needle as Will, who at the time is possessed, just like Billy will be in a few months. Billy's storyline in the third season as the main transmitter of the hive mind emphasizes the fears of bisexual men that were building because of AIDS. His behavior emulating that of a sexual predator also exemplifies the fears of the time. Bisexuals at the time were a mysterious sexual other, seen as highly promiscuous and non-monogamous. They emulate everything that heterosexual culture looked down upon and blamed gay men for during the AIDS crisis, as well as a new type of fear and threat to their way of life and health. Heather as Billy's first victim is significant. An assumedly heterosexual woman from a wealthy, well-respected suburban white family that is then invaded by the sexually deviant, diseased other is the perfect horror story for the time period of rising fears during the AIDS crisis. The Satanic Panic was a moral panic that broke out in the 1980s. This panic surrounded fears of Satanism and what would become known as satanic ritual abuse, also known as SRA. I'm going to be brief in my explanation of this and focus on the overall point, as the topic is vast and could be a whole essay on its own. The origin of the Satanic Panic comes from the now discredited autobiographical novel Michelle Remembers from the year 1980. The book chronicles Michelle Smith's time in therapy with Dr. Lawrence Pazder. Both credited as co-authors of the book, they explain how Dr. Pazder helped to uncover Michelle's supposed repressed memories of SRA. The book details outlandish tales of child abuse and devil worship. Michelle falsely recalls, among other things, multiple instances of being covered in blood, including animal blood, and multiple instances of anal rape, as well as witnessing various rituals and sacrifices of children and animals. She also claimed to have been in direct contact with Jesus and the Virgin Mary, as well as witnessed the summoning of and appearance of Satan. Other real-world crimes and accusations played a large part in the building of the moral panic. the McMartin preschool trial being the most well-known. The case lasted 7 years and cost over $15 million, making it the longest and most expensive case in the history of the United States legal system. It led to no convictions. In 1983, Judy Johnson, a mother of one of the children at the preschool's daycare, accused a male teacher, Ray Buckley, of having molested her 2-year-old son after he came home with bowel issues and a pain in his anus. Following this, a letter was sent to other parents urging them to question their children in case they had been abused. Judy Johnson began making more claims that became increasingly more bizarre, accusing Ray and other teachers of chopping up rabbits, flying in the air, dressing as religious figures while abusing the children and drawing stars on them, etc. A child consultant, Key McFarlane, was called in to interview the children. By 1984, over 360 children were falsely diagnosed as being sexually abused after the interviews. During the trial, more bizarre claims are made against Ray Buckley and the McMartin staff, alleging that the children were forced to witness and partake in animal sacrifices and drink the blood of animals, that there was an elaborate system of tunnels beneath the school where the sexual abuse took place, and that this was all connected to satanic worship. The school was excavated to look for the underground tunnels, and none were ever found. Judy Johnson was later hospitalized and diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia. She later died of alcohol poisoning in her home in 1986 before the trial was over. In the years following the case, some of the children have spoken about their previous claims of abuse. Cal Zappolo, who was 8 when he was interviewed, later said that his claims were all made up for the love and attention of the adults around him. He said, quote, "I would try and think of the worst thing possible that would be harmful to a child. From going to church, you know that God is good and the devil is bad and has horns and is about evil and red and blood. I'd just throw a twist in there with Satan and devil worshipping." Another was Maureen Flanagan, who, when interviewed by Key McFarlane, was told that her claims of having experienced no abuse must have been due to fear or oppression. Quote, "I was introduced to sexual concepts, not between a mum and a dad, but between teachers and babies, basically. My 10-year-old brain exploded. I knew early on if I didn't give her what she wanted, I wasn't getting out of that room." End quote. Her parents were told that she had most likely been abused, something that she would come to believe, and that haunted her for years since. Along with these claims was a growing fear of Dungeons & Dragons and heavy metal music. In 1983, the parents of Irving Lee Pulling, the 16-year-old boy who had committed suicide a year prior, filed a lawsuit against his high school's principal for allowing Dungeons & Dragons to be played on school grounds in an after-school club. She believed that the in-game curse that had been put on her son's character before he went home and committed suicide was what led to his death. The case was dismissed, but Patricia Pulling was not dissuaded from her beliefs, and she soon founded the organization BADD, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. She claimed that D&D encouraged blasphemy, cannibalism, suicide, and demon summoning. This all took to the media not long after the coverage of another suicide. James Dallas Egbert III, who had disappeared and hidden inside of his college campus after attempting suicide in 1979. The media linked his suicide attempt to his playing of D&D. He ultimately survived, only to later commit suicide in 1981. The book Mazes and Monsters was written about the case. It continued to put the blame on D&D and was adapted into a film in 1981 starring a young Tom Hanks. Alongside this movie was a growing widespread media coverage of theories of Dungeons & Dragons being linked to Satanism, giving it and its players a long-lasting negative reputation. Looking back on the correlation of suicide and antisocial behavior with D&D players, it's clear to see that the case was simply that many bullied, outcast, and mentally ill children and teens found comfort in a game about escapism and heroism. A 17-year-old boy named Ricky Queso murdered his friend Gary Lauers while high on mescaline. Queso claimed to be a Satanist, and 2 friends who witnessed the crime stated that he had commanded that Lauers proclaim to love Satan before he killed him. Queso also claimed that he committed the crime because Satan had appeared to him and told him to. Surrounding the crime over-dramatized Queso's connection to Satanism and claimed he was part of a group that was going around committing ritualistic killings in the name of Satan. When arrested, Queso was wearing an AC/DC t-shirt. He was also found to be a fan of other metal bands and singers, including Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne. This led to the association of metal music and Satanism, something that was alluded to in the press release following the crime, and that was encouraged by his father, who said that Queso's metal band t-shirts had Satanist symbols on them. In 1985, 20-year-old James Vance and 18-year-old Raymond Belknap attempted suicide in a park together by shooting themselves. Vance survived, but Belknap did not. Vance then tried to sue Judas Priest, claiming that there was subliminal messaging in their Stained Glass album that led Belknap and him to attempt suicide. He did not win the lawsuit. There are a plethora of other instances of metal music being blamed for crimes and said to promote Satanism. I would argue that the Satanic Panic is not just a result of these cases, but also has a direct connection to the fear of AIDS. The media coverage of the AIDS crisis was never just about a disease. It was also viewed as a moral failing, especially by Christians.
The gay plague, as AIDS has been called, is the center of a political storm. The moral majority claiming AIDS is God's punishment for the gay lifestyle.
All this media attention and sympathy for these AIDS victims just really bothers me. Let's call a spade a spade. AIDS is a venereal disease, and the vast majority of its victims are a group of abnormal people with a very strange and unusual lifestyle.
For many people, AIDS was seen as a result of promiscuity, homosexuality, and drug use. In 1983, Reverend Jerry Falwell perpetuates this idea of ascribing morality and religion to the existence of AIDS.
And Reverend Jerry Falwell, founder of the Moral Majority and pastor of the Thomas Road Baptist Church. Reverend Falwell, you've called for the closing of bathhouses and other measures, and you say you're calling for these measures to protect the health of the nation. But at the same time, you say AIDS is God's judgment on homosexual promiscuity.
I believe that God does not judge people, God judges sin. And I do believe that herpes is primarily caused by heterosexual promiscuity, and AIDS, generally caused and believed to be caused by homosexual promiscuity, is a violation, both of them, of God's laws of nature and decency, and as a result, God, who loves people, hates sin and deals, whether it's a drug addict or an alcoholic or someone who's living promiscuously as far as his or her moral life is concerned. We pay the price when we violate the laws of God.
But I guess what critics are wondering is whether you'd make the same moral judgment about cancer or measles.
I've answered that many times. I don't feel that God punishes people. I believe that God deals with sin. I do not believe that God is wiping out promiscuous heterosexuals or homosexual. We've had the privilege of leading to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ many, many homosexuals. I can think of pastors now in the pulpit who are heterosexual, living normal lives, who came to us, first of all, as practicing homosexuals. We introduced them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were born again. Their lifestyles were changed. We trained them, educated them at Liberty Baptist College, and now pastoring churches. So there are hundreds and thousands of former homosexuals who've been saved by the grace of God, but we are not really showing a loving concern for people when we tell them that their misbehavior, their moral misbehavior is good, when in fact we know it isn't. God loves people, God hates sin, and we can certainly make the distinction as well.
Reverend Falwell, how do you feel about the possibility that because you are making statements and other people are making statements and linking this disease to a minority of homosexuals, male homosexuals, that the entire gay community is going to suffer?
So forth. 93% of all Americans believe that homosexuality is not an acceptable alternate lifestyle. But at the same time, I don't know of any thinking and serious Americans or Canadians who would want to deny homosexuals their civil rights or the rights of jobs and housing, etc. It's simply we're trying to say we have an epidemic. 700 people are dead. Thousands more are going to die. And if, in fact, Reverend Perry really is for loving, caring relationships, then he should agree with me that the homosexual bathhouses, which everyone knows are just for the most dirty, vulgar, filthy, bloody occurrences, anal intercourse, and worse, then he should agree with me they should be shut down, because that is where, according to what little information we have, there's the transmission of the disease.
10 years later, Reverend Billy Graham in 1993 said, quote, "Is AIDS a judgment of God? I could not say for sure, but I think so." Not shocking to see that the foundations of the Satanic Panic came from the false claims of the sodomization and rape of children and instances of mentally ill or drug-abusing teenagers. These worries are not directly related to the AIDS crisis, but speak to a wider set of overlapping fears: a fear of immorality, of unchristian sex, such as sodomy, of illness and of blood, etc. I don't think it's a surprise that the Satanic Panic took place during the era where AIDS as a topic was on the rise and barely understood by those outside of communities of homosexuals and drug users. In this era, to be anyone in a small town or a religious community in America during this time who did any of the following: played D&D, partook in drug use, partook in acts of homosexual sex, listened to metal music, was gay or thought to be gay, then you are most likely ostracized and a target of hate and fear. In Season 4, we are introduced to Eddie Munson, a character who I believe fits into all of the above. Eddie's very first scene is incredibly unsubtle and tells us exactly what he is about to represent.
The devil
started as a harmless game of make-believe now has both parents and psychologists concerned. He studies and links violent behavior to the game, saying it promotes satanic worship, ritual sacrifice, sodomy, suicide, and even murder.
Eddie is the perfect victim of the satanic panic, the ideal outcast and scapegoat. He is a dungeon master who runs the D&D club named the Hellfire Club, represented by a symbol of a demonic face. He's also a heavy metal fan, his battle jacket covered in pins and patches of bands like Dio, Iron Maiden, Wasp, Megadeth, and Judas Priest. He also plays in a band with his friends. Eddie is also a high school drug dealer and drug user. His selling of drugs to cheerleader Chrissy Cunningham is what leads to his downfall and direct involvement with the plot. Instantaneously being labeled as a suspect and assumed to be the killer, the manhunt for Eddie, perpetuated by Hawkins High's most clean-cut, respectable students, is to be expected given how he so perfectly represents the feared outcast of the satanic panic.
I don't know what this priest did to Chrissy, but he did something sick. Probably sacrificed her, drained her blood for the devil. I guess Satanists do that. Hey, that's what I'm saying. It's this cult isn't. Hellfire isn't a cult. It's just a D&D club. D&D? Dungeons and Dragons? It's like a game. Shit, I read the wrong person plays this game. It can warp their mind. They confuse fantasy and reality, and innocent people die. I mean, it's been happening all over the country. It's like an epidemic. Yeah, I read about that shit. It's real. And I think Eddie, he's the wrong type of person. Right? Then let's go on some break! Yeah! For Christ's sake! And Eddie Munson is the leader of one of these cults. A cult that operates right here in Hawkins. The Mallfire. All those unexplained deaths over the years. Some people, they say our town is cursed. They just don't know why. Now we do. Now we know. They call themselves Hellfire.
That's bullshit. The Hellfire isn't a cult. It's a club for nerds.
A club. A club. A harmless club. That's what they want you to think. But it's a lie. A lie designed to conceal the truth. And now this cult is protecting its leader, Eddie. Hiding him. Allowing him to continue his rampage. Last night I became overcome with this feeling of hopelessness. Then I remembered Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil. And I've come to accept an awful truth. These murders are ritualistic sacrifices.
I'd also like to draw attention to how the language used to describe the satanic panic fears throughout this season is very coded in sickness and disease.
To Chrissy, but he did something sick. We've all heard about how satanic cults are spreading through our country like some disease. Part of his sick game. I mean, it's been happening all over the country. It's like an epidemic.
I'd also argue that he is heavily gay-coded. Stranger Things has strayed away from the usage of hard-hitting offensive language and slurs in recent seasons. Season 1's fag, queer, and fairy made Will's perceived homosexuality obvious, but in Season 4, the word freak is the closest we have. Eddie's nickname is the Freak, and he has consistently called this throughout the season. The word feels ineffective as an insult on its own, but if we look at the implications of this kind of name-calling, it's likely that it is used in place of any homophobic slurs. In this scene, the emphasis on the phrase narrow-minded, followed by the shared look between Robin and Eddie, is significant.
But if we find out about you, it's only a matter of time before others do too, and once that gets out, everyone and their shallow-minded mother is going to be gunning for you.
I'm a freak, right?
Exactly.
Robin as a lesbian and the only queer character to come out on the show adds a new context to this interaction. Both she and Eddie know something about this word and are communicating it to each other. Also wears a black handkerchief in his back right pocket. Many recognize this as a nod to Metallica frontman James Hetfield, who often wears a lucky handkerchief when performing. However, the handkerchief has a second meaning. In the 70s and 80s, a flagging system called the Hanky Code was enacted by placing a handkerchief pertaining to a certain color in the back pocket. This was used by gay men to discreetly signal their sexual preferences to other gay men when cruising. The meaning of the colors often varied slightly by area, and guides to them were often hung up in gay bars. The black that Eddie wears is most often attributed to BDSM, which tracks considering he also has pair of handcuffs in his bedroom. The likelihood of Eddie being aware of hanky code I don't think is as low as most presume. Obviously there aren't going to be any gay bars in Hawkins, but in season 1 we see that Jonathan is able to drive to visit Lonnie, who lives in or near Indianapolis, in less than a day. Eddie by season 4 is 20 years old and owns a truck. It's not unlikely that he might have been to a gay bar in Indianapolis. Also, most obviously, his scenes of flirtation with Steve. Now, I've used Steve to comment on and theorize about characters' sexualities before. That's because Steve within the show is very tied to sex and sexuality. He's the only character, along with Nancy, to ever have a sex scene, and he's also one of the only characters to ever say the word sex on screen.
Really want to start another relationship that has no point other than sex? I mean, I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
He's also the closest thing the show has to a typical teen heartthrob or sex symbol. So much so that in season 3, his inability to charm and date women becomes a whole subplot for him.
Ahoy, ladies! I didn't see you there. Would you guys like to set sail on this ocean of flavor with me? I'll be your captain. I'm Steve Harrington. Can I get you guys a little taste of cherry jubilee? No? Anybody? Banana boat? 4 people? 4 spoons? Sheridan booth? Anybody?
More often than not, we're able to get insight into the sexualities of characters around him based on their behavior. One, Steve serves as Nancy's sexual awakening, and in season 4 represents a sort of sexual reawakening for her after she's been alone for so long with Jonathan gone, and as she plays out the same traumas that connected her to the plot in the first season. Both Robin and Barb are singled out, and in Barb's case, outcasted by their disinterest in Steve, with Robin coming out as a lesbian to him in season 3.
Do you remember what I said about Click's class? About me being jealous and, like, obsessed?
Yeah.
It isn't because I had a crush on you. It's because she wouldn't stop staring at you.
Mrs. Click.
Tammy Thompson. I wanted her to look at me. But she couldn't pull her eyes away from you and your stupid hair. And I didn't understand because you would get bagel crumbs all over the floor. And you asked dumb questions. And you were a douchebag. And you didn't even like her. And I would go home and just scream into my pillow.
Tammy Thompson's a girl.
Steve.
Yeah.
Billy's moments of innuendo and flirtation leave room for queer interpretation on his part, and Tammy Thompson, Robin's first crush and heartbreak, was seen to be heterosexual due to her crush on Steve. Even Max has her comedic relief moment.
Oh, when Steve gets so hairy, right? I keep telling him he needs to tame that jungle, but he claims the ladies dig it.
Let me see.
What?
With this in mind, we can look at these moments of clear one-sided flirtation between Eddie and Steve as a way to read into Eddie's characterization and queer coding.
I guess I can accept the fact that Steve Harrington is actually a good dude. Rich parents, popular, chicks love him. Not a douche? No way, man. No way. Still super jealous as hell, but it's great.
It's not exactly a car, Steve.
I'm not sure I love the idea of you driving.
Oh, I'm starting to suck her. Harrington's got her. Don't you, big boy?
With all this, we see that Eddie is characterized in the same way as the other queer-coded / canonically queer characters are in the series, by insulting language and ostracization, and also sexuality confirmation via Steve. Having established this, we can look at his storyline and death and what it represents. He is largely blamed for the deaths that take place due to Vector's curse, as the representation for all that is feared and hated during the rise of moral conservatism in this era is an easy scapegoat for the town of increasingly afraid and conservative people. Not only a drug user, D&D player, likely homosexual and metalhead, he is also 20 years old, still in high school, and running D&D club for a group of boys around the ages of 15 and older, right around the time that the unfounded fears arose surrounding a school thought to involve homosexual pedophiles using children for devil worship. Deaths that occur in the 4th season are much more in line with the metaphor for suicide than AIDS. The reaction from the town reflects very much the public's reaction to AIDS. After multiple deaths have already taken place over the years, the public first begins to listen when it affects heterosexual men and women, following which blame is thrown around, religious fear and judgment begins, and those from the most difficult backgrounds are blamed. Eddie, as a likely gay drug user, represents those blamed and those suffering the most during the AIDS crisis. It's also worth mentioning that Eddie's death is by bats, another animal associated with disease. His death is also able to be read as a suicide. Eddie sacrifices himself for his friends after discovering how much he is feared and hated. Many men with AIDS felt the same weight and sorrow. A lot of them went out on their own terms.
Buy more time.
AIDS first began to spread in the Soviet Union between the years of 1985 and 1987. The records of this show a very minor amount of the population affected, especially compared to the US at the time, with the number of HIV-positive people in the Soviet Union recorded as only 34 by 1987. In Season 3, we know that Soviet scientists began trying to create a rift sometime between late 1984 and early 1985, but were unsuccessful and instead opted to travel to the US to attempt opening a portal there, not successful by the summer of 1985. By the end of this season and the beginning of the next, we find that after the explosion in the summer of 85, Hopper was taken as prisoner by the surviving members of the KGB. Following this, we see in Season 4 that in Kamchatka, there is a Demogorgon and multiple Demodogs being grown in controlled vats. We can assume that when Hopper was taken prisoner was when the KGB were able to capture a Demogorgon. Following the metaphor of the Demogorgon as HIV, it tracks that the Russians traveled to America and in 1985 brought back a Demogorgon. By 1986, a very small amount of the Russian population are killed by the creature as more Demogorgons begin to grow. In the scenes leading up to the fight between Hopper and the other prisoners against the Demogorgon, the show makes a point to portray the creature as an intelligent hunter able to adapt to its surroundings.
You guys, this zvier, about 9 feet tall, thin, white skin, no face, no eyes.
Давай, переводи.
Этот зверь 3 метра ростом, белый, без лица.
А ты откуда знаешь?
Because I've seen one. I fought one. And all your theories about it, they're all wrong. You know why they feed captive predators live prey? Because if they don't, the predator gets bored and it stops eating. It needs the thrill of the hunt. We're not here to train this monster with swords and axes. We're here to entertain it. And this food isn't to make us strong. It's to make us plump. So we're full of all the nutrients and protein that a growing monster might need.
Hopper explains to the other prisoners that he and the others are not there to win against or really fight the Demogorgon, and to entertain it so that it can continue to hunt and grow. I have held off from discussing Elle and her role in this until now because of a scene in Season 4 that my perception is based on.
You have fought this evil before, and you've won. But this evil is like a virus. Each time it returns, it comes back stronger, smarter, deadlier. A war is coming to Hawkins, but there are others who don't believe in you, who think you are the cause. I believe they're wrong. I believe you're the cure.
I think this foreshadows Elle's role as the cure to the AIDS-related storyline. Of course, this all depends on where season 5 takes her story, and I'll be honest that this is something I'm not entirely sure of, so we'll have to see. With that being said, Elle, like Will, has a lot of coding surrounding possibly being HIV positive. To understand this, we first have to look at her mother, Terry Ives. Terry is mentally disabled and unresponsive after electroshock therapy, but her condition is also reminiscent of HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder, a condition that occurs when HIV infects the brain, which can result in a similar type of impairment. In season 2, there's another allusion to this while Will is in hospital and has a brain scan.
There are the hippocampal abnormalities we had discussed. Nothing out of line with what we've seen from others suffering from post-traumatic stress. But this is Will from last night. Now, as you can see, there are now abnormalities in the limbic and paralimbic areas. And this is from an hour ago.
When part of MK Ultra, Terry was tested by being drugged, possibly with unclean syringes during intravenous drug use. Though this took place in the late 60s to early 70s, HIV can be in the body and undetectable for up to 10 years. Reminiscent of babies who are born HIV positive due to their mothers contracting the virus before or during pregnancy. This is a scene in season 2 that stands out to me. The Upside Down is biohazardous and causes sickness. The scene of Elle from the beginning of season 2, where she exits an upside down portal, looks incredibly reminiscent of a birth. This is the same season where Elle goes on her journey to contact and learn about Terry. That being said, I don't think Elle's role is the same as Will's as someone who is metaphorically HIV positive. I think she is instead what I'll be referring to as the mythical vaccine. Incredibly brief overview of HIV drugs and medication, AZT or azidothimidine was originally developed in the 1960s as a drug to combat cancer. It was for it to insert itself into the cancer cell and damage its ability to replicate, but proved ineffective when tested on mice and then forgotten. After the outbreak of AIDS, the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome began to test possible HIV agents. Among these tests was Compound S, which was a remade version of the original AZT. When tested, it appeared to block the spread of infection. Soon drug trials were started, and by March 1987, the drug was put on the market as the first drug to combat AIDS. AZT on its own proved ineffective, with those taking the drug eventually showing rising viral loads and in many cases having the virus affect them differently as it had mutated to resist the drug. In 1991, multiple other nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor drugs, NRTIs, were FDA approved. NRTIs block the HIV enzymes that allow it to replicate. AZT, which is also an NRTI, these drugs had the same issues of not being effective enough and resulting in the virus mutating. There have been over 25 different drugs developed since AZT was first used to treat AIDS, and there are 6 different classes of drugs used in HIV treatment. Protease inhibitors and non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors were introduced, and it was these drugs that revolutionized HIV treatment. Protease inhibitors are used to combat viruses by preventing the enzymes from creating copies of the virus. They have also been used for treatment for illnesses such as hepatitis C and COVID-19. NNRTIs work similarly to NRTIs but attack a slightly different part of the enzyme. Highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART for short, is a treatment regimen that combines these HIV medications so that together they can be more effective. A combination of 2 NRTIs, a PI, or a NNRTI was found to successfully suppress viral loads. This led to a dramatic change in the morbidity and mortality rates for those with HIV, and the method of using 2 NRTIs plus a third agent is the backbone of most treatment today, called combination antiretroviral therapy, or CART. Due to this, drugs and HIV diagnosis is no longer a death sentence. There's still many other developments in HIV drugs, particularly in preventative drugs, but there is still no vaccine or cure for HIV/AIDS. The majority of vaccines work by using some aspect of the virus or virus cells to work against it. Elle's arc and character being connected to the Upside Down, combined with her potential to be what cures it, works much like a vaccine. It also makes the previously mentioned HIV coding of her character make sense. The scene, and keeping in mind what Elle may represent, it is incredibly clear.
This evil is like a virus. Each time it returns, it comes back stronger, smarter, deadlier. I believe you're the cure.
Owens directly compares this evil to a virus, one that comes back stronger after Elle's attempts at defeat. Demogorgon in Season 1 is defeated by Eleven. It comes back again in the form of multiple Demodogs, and as the shadow monster that affects Will. Elle then closes the gate on the shadow monster, only for it to come back again in Season 3 as the Mind Flayer. Much like AZT fighting off the HIV virus, only for it to come back mutated and stronger. Like an ineffective drug, Elle is attacked and rendered powerless at the end of Season 3, but helps in the attack against it, only for this evil to come back in its strongest form in Season 4, where she and the others fail to successfully defeat Vecna, leading to the hospitalization and deaths of their friends, and for this evil to spread across the entire town, resulting in multiple deaths and casualties. If in Season 5, Elle is able to harness her now stronger and altered powers to act like the cure that Owens says she may be, then she will become the mythical vaccine. This season, it's discovered that there's another crime that took place in Hawkins that directly connects to the supernatural plot. It is known as the Victor Creel murders. These date back to 1959. The first confirmed case of HIV, though not known at the time, in a human also dates back to 1959. I won't be getting into the details of the play, but in connection to Season 4, play about 1959's events, titled Stranger Things: The First Shadow, is on in Broadway and the West End currently, and has been since 2023. It's revealed in this play that Henry and the other children's powers have to do with Henry's blood type. Henry has a unique blood type that no one else has. His blood is then used in multiple experiments and blood transfusions to create the other children with powers. This leads to Eleven, who is implied to be the closest to or have his exact blood type, which may play into the possibility of her being the cure. In 1987, CDC launched America Responds to AIDS, a media campaign with the goal of educating as wide a national audience as possible about AIDS. This increased overall coverage and awareness about AIDS massively. Despite the season not airing yet, evidence of this is already apparent. In the background of this photo sent to the Stranger Things broadcast channel via Instagram, we can see this poster. Posters from the Texas Department of Health sometime between 1986 and 1987. Text reads, quote, "If you had 2 sex partners, and your partners had each had 2 other sex partners, and their sex partners had 2 other sex partners, etc., then it's as if you've had sex with 512 people. Any one of them could have given you the virus that causes AIDS. To find out what to do now, call the toll-free Texas AIDS line." This poster will be the first ever on-screen mention and depiction of AIDS, officially making the AIDS crisis no longer fully subtext. From this I assume and hope that HIV/AIDS may become a topic covered in more detail this season. In Susan Sontag's 1989 essay, AIDS and Its Metaphors, an add-on to her 1978 book, Illness and Metaphor, she discusses the use of military metaphors when discussing illness and AIDS. Quote, "The metaphor implements the way particularly dreaded diseases are envisaged as an alien other, as enemies are in modern war, and the move from the demonization of the illness to the attribution of fault to the patient is an inevitable one, no matter if patients are thought of as victims. Victims suggest innocence, and innocence by the inexorable logic that governs all relational terms suggests guilt. Military metaphors contribute to the stigmatizing of certain illnesses and by extension those who are ill." End quote. The next season deals heavily with the military. Hawkins is under quarantine after the last season's events, and this quarantine is being enforced by the military who have moved into the town. We see them in many shots in the trailers so far. Sontag also says, quote, "AIDS has dual metaphoric genealogy. As a microprocess, it is described as a cancer is, an invasion. When the focus is transmission of the disease, an older metaphor, reminiscent of syphilis, is invoked, pollution. But the military metaphors used to describe AIDS have a somewhat different focus from the usual in describing cancer. With cancer, the metaphor scans the issue of casualty and picks up at the point at the rogue cells inside the body mutate, eventually moving out from an original site or organ to overrun other organs or systems, a domestic subversion. In the description of AIDS, the enemy is what causes the disease, an infectious agent that comes from the outside." End quote. She then goes on to quote an article's description of AIDS and adds, quote, "This is the language of political paranoia, with its characteristic distrust of a pluralistic world. A defense system consisting of cells that, among other things, produce antibodies to deal with the threat is predictably no match for an invader who advances single-mindedly. And the science fiction flavor already present in cancer talk is even more pungent in accounts of AIDS. In the era of Star Wars and Space Invaders, AIDS has proved an ideally comprehensible illness." End quote. This commentary on AIDS metaphors and their relation to science fiction and military is relevant to the entire show and particularly this upcoming season. In action and militarization, this war on an invading force spreading death across town is in full swing. During the AIDS crisis, lesbians were some of the most helpful in aiding those infected with the disease. During the beginning of the epidemic, men who have sex with men were banned from donating their blood due to a fear of AIDS-infected blood supplies infecting the wider population. Unfortunately, many HIV people needed blood transfusions due to frequent cases of severe anemia due to the disease. The San Diego Blood Sisters formed in direct response to this. Barbara Vick, Wendy Sue Bjelgelsen, and Nicolette Ibarra organized the first blood drive on July 16, 1983 at the San Diego Blood Bank in Hillcrest. Vick later recalled of this time, quote, "There was a powerlessness everybody felt, but the lesbian community seemed immune to the disease. I don't want to say there was guilt, but you look at counterparts bearing this burden for no reason. At that time, women had a lot less to give economically, but blood is such a basic thing," end quote. Between 1983 and 1992, the Blood Sisters hosted 12 blood drives. The article quoting Vick also states, quote, "Beyond just organizing blood drives, many lesbians also stepped in as caregivers by volunteering in hospitals and clinics, as well as raising money to combat the epidemic. Many AIDS patients felt alone, rejected by families, and were lacking in any kind of emotional support. So the Blood Sisters were able to act with compassion and empathy by providing that care," end quote. Stranger Things has 1, potentially 2 confirmed lesbians on the show. Vicki Dunn was introduced in season 4 as a love interest to Robin, who came out in season 3. Due to the setup of their relationship and the implications about her sexuality in season 4, we can assume that she is a lesbian.
You ask out a girl and she says no. Big deal. Nothing happened. Maybe your ego's a little bruised, but I asked out the wrong girl and bam, I'm a town pariah.
Yeah, I'd buy that, except that Vicky is definitely not the wrong girl.
We just don't know that, do we?
She returned fast times, paused at 53 minutes, 5 seconds. Do you know who pauses fast times at 53 minutes, 5 seconds? People who like boobies, Robin. Boobies!
Say boobies!
Not a big deal, okay? I like boobies. You like boobies. Vicky likes boobies. Definitely.
My boyfriend was my boyfriend. He was like, "I'm out of here, back to Purdue, good luck, Vic." Okay, but ultimately, yeah, it's fine, and it's bordering on a good thing. I mean, he was really grating on me. I mean, he's the type of person who trashes fast times that has no plot. I mean, as soon as he said that, I should have just ended things right there. And I have just made a peanut butter monstrosity.
And either way, her proximity to lesbianism via Robin is significant to her character. Based on set photos and merch, we know that Vicky will be volunteering at the hospital next season. We also know that from the trailers, Robin and Will are going to be paired up together this season. Will is going to be a main character in season 5, so having Robin as a supporting character to him will mirror the lesbians that stepped up and helped gay men during the AIDS crisis, while Vicky's role at the hospital may do the same. Robin and Vicky's most significant scene together takes place shortly after we see Robin near the Be a Hero Give Blood sign in the auditorium. I also want to mention that in the newest trailer, the song Who Wants to Live Forever by Queen plays. This focuses on mortality and was written around the time Freddie Mercury first got tested for HIV. He would later be diagnosed with AIDS in 1987 and would pass away from AIDS complications in 1991. The song went on to be known as a memorial song for him and was heavily associated with AIDS after his passing. Regardless of the show's upcoming ending and the way it's received, it's undeniable that Stranger Things is telling a story that is interwoven with the political and social truths of the AIDS crisis. If you stuck around this far, I want to say thank you. This essay has been in the works for over 6 months, and this analysis started over 3 years ago. It's become very important to me, and I hope that this has meant something to you too. I also want to say that HIV is not a thing of the past, and there is still an ongoing crisis, and I implore you to learn more about this if it interests you. My list of sources will be at the end of the video and down below. I also want to thank my sister for additional research, proofreading, and video editing, and my friend Brishti for helping me with the research and to be able to access some of the sources. I also want to thank my friends Annie, M, Nikki, and Vion for encouragement.